Dan Hannan came into the IEA to talk about his new book, and while he was here, ieaTV got a chance to ask him a few questions on his views on Europe and its economic future.
What do you think the principal economic benefits would be for the United Kingdom if we actually left the European Union?
I think the EU would be better off, Europe would be better off as a whole, scaling back the EU to be simply a trade bloc with intergovernmental collaboration. But of course that isn't my call. I'm not a Dutch or Greek or German legislator. I'm a British legislator. What is my call is what relation is Britain going to have with it? And I think there is no question that we would be better off raising our eyes across the oceans and rediscovering those more distant horizons that our fathers took for granted.
Do you think, Dan, that it would be best all round if the European Union itself was dissolved, not just Britain leaving it and no longer being a part of the European Union? Do you think the European Union itself should be wound up?
I would like to have a European architecture where you have free trade and intergovernmental collaboration, where countries agree to do jointly what they can't do singly, right? You'd have to be insane to be against that. I've never met a British Eurosceptic who is opposed to that. Does that require all the bureaucracy, all the economic direction, the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, the foreign policy, the European arrest warrant? Of course not. Now, some countries may want to go ahead with those things, and that's a matter for their electorates and for their governments to work out as sovereign countries. What interests me is extending the European market. If Britain were to succeed in getting a kind of EEA light deal, a free trade plus deal, associate membership, whatever you want to call it, my guess is that all of the other non-members would line up asking for something similar. So that you would have, in practice, two separate European structures. You'd have a pan-continental free trade area with 35, 40 member states stretching from Iceland and the Faroe Islands through to Turkey and Georgia. And then within that, you'd have a much smaller group of 20, 25 countries with their single currency, their single president, foreign ministry, and all the rest of it. Wouldn't that leave everybody happier? The Federalists would be able to go ahead without fear of a British veto. We would get the common market we thought we were getting 40 years ago. They would lose a bad tenant and gain a good neighbour.
Can I ask you to imagine a very different country, perhaps a much smaller nation, perhaps an ex-communist nation, perhaps a country that doesn't have the same traditions around liberty and free markets that might exist in the UK. Can you imagine circumstances where it might be in their best interest to actually join the European Union?
For almost every country, EU membership is a product of pessimism of some kind or another. The Italians joined because they'd given up on their politicians. The former communist countries joined to get away from the wretched past, the misery that they'd been through. The Germans obviously had this particular self-abnegation. The French were nervous about their position in Europe. We joined at our lowest moment. I mean, people have forgotten, if ever they really felt at the time, how bad things were in the early to mid-70s. You know, the 3-day week, prices and incomes policies, power cuts, food shortages. I wonder whether it would have been possible to carry the country in favour of common market membership either 10 years before that or 10 years after. I wonder whether the necessary sense of national despair would have been there. I understand that every country has its own story. I understand every country has its own reasons for coming in. But the one common thread is that it is a product of despair. A confident democratic country like Norway or Switzerland feels no need to trade its present liberties for some utopian dream.
Dan, you've always been a staunch and vocal supporter of Britain leaving the European Union, but you've also been a staunch advocate throughout your political career of free markets. I wonder, who do you think are the best non-British advocates of free markets that you come across in the European Union? And do they tend to agree with you on the faults of the European Union? Do they tend to support the breakup of the EU? Or are they actually on the pro-European Union side of the argument?
I mean, there are some great free market thinkers in Europe, and particularly among the young people. There are some great student organisations that are, in our terms, libertarian movements. But when I look at the continental supporters of capitalism and personal freedom and free markets, they are rarely directly involved with politics. There are academics who have dipped a toe into the political field. I'm thinking of people like Pedro Schwartz in Spain, Roland Waubel in Germany, Antonio Martino in Italy. He was the supremely successful one in that he went on to be foreign minister, but they all made their biggest mark as thinkers. Which brings us to the paradox of the free market movement. We have won the battle of ideas while losing the battle of implementation. What do I mean by that? Well, the IEA is coming up for 60 years old. When the IEA was founded, arguments had to be made that nowadays have been won. Right? Nobody now argues from first principles in favour of the state regulating how much you can earn, what you can charge for your goods. Nobody argues for state plans saying how many chocolate bars and cars we need to produce. And yet, although that intellectual victory has been won, we have not been able to capitalise on it in the sense of translating it into public policy. Taxes are higher than ever. The percentage of the economy taken by state spending is higher than ever. And the fields which people now regard as proper for government intervention is wider than it was 60 years ago when this institute was founded. How do we explain that paradox, that we're winning the arguments, but the state keeps growing? Well, this is about how government works. The brilliant academics make their arguments, but the politicians become encased in the state machine, surrounded by the permanent apparatchiks who have a personal vested interest in the enlargement of state power. And that's why we need a completely different kind of political structure. One where you don't just get the right people, but you change the way it's done, or that wonderful way that Milton Friedman put it in the 70s. It's not about getting the right people into power, it's about creating a climate where even the wrong people will do the right thing.
Eurosceptics, particularly British Eurosceptics, seem to have been predicting the imminent demise of the single currency ever since it was launched, perhaps even before it was launched. Yet the euro is still there, some 15 years on. Do you actually think it will break up? And if so, when?
I've never been someone who's predicted the demise of the euro, and I'm not going to start now. In fact, the whole problem is that the euro is being kept together. That's what we mean by the euro crisis. Not that it's about to break apart, but that it isn't. That millions of people are suffering preventable unemployment because of the political goal of keeping the euro in place as a symbol of political integration. Obviously, what should happen is that the stricken Mediterranean economies are able to default, price their way back into the market, and begin to grow again. Now, look, I'm enough of an Austrian economist to say that devaluations don't solve everything, but they buy you that space. They buy you that time in which you can make reforms. There's such a thing as being too purist about these things. Sometimes you need to just worry about the insulin injection and keeping the patient going before you worry about the broader surgery.
If you were asked for your advice on how to bring about an orderly or at least a managed breakup of the single currency in the Eurozone, what would your advice be?
All of the options here are difficult, and anybody who pretends that there is a pain-free option is deluding himself or deceiving his hearer. All of the futures are cloudy when you have a debt level as we have and when we've come through the crisis that we have. But I think an orderly breakup, or let's call it a managed breakup, is now plainly the least bad option. Technically, how would I do it? Well, I think it would be easier in the sense of avoiding the bank runs if it were Germany and her satellite economies that left the single currency, bequeathing the legal carcass of the euro to the struggling Mediterranean states. But the idea that there is a technical block, that it's complicated to the point of insuperable obstacles, is demonstrably false. The last monetary breakup we had in Europe was Czechoslovakia 20 years ago. And essentially what happened is that after the markets had closed on a Friday, the head of the Slovak central bank phoned up all the banks and said, someone from my office is going to come around with a stamp to put on your banknotes. Those will then be the Slovak crowns. On the Monday morning, Slovakia had a new currency. It initially devalued. I think it devalued by something like 22% at the maximum point of difference from the Czech crown. Then it bounced back. Both the Czech and Slovak republics grew impressively, being able to suit their monetary policy to their own interests. Slovakia was the surprise success story of the divorce. Nobody now argues that they would have been better off staying with a single currency. So the idea that this can't be done on a technical level, I'm afraid that is tendentious and demonstrably false claim from people who have a vested interest for political reasons in keeping the thing going.